Today we will be looking at 3 horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. All of them are terrifying in their own ways, but the last 2 will put you on the verge of your seats. As always, viewer discretion is advised. On April 6, 1985, in the silent wilderness of Rockcastle County, Kentucky, 3 friends embarked on what they believed would be a routine caving expedition. They were experienced, confident, and curious, a combination that would lead them into the heart of a nightmare. The entrance to Up and Down Cave loomed before them, an unassuming crack in the earth that opened into the unknown. The group consisted of Christine Gerace, Jack Lewis, and Ben Harris. Their goal was a descent into a pit accessible only by a narrow 70-foot shaft, what cavers call a chimney. It was the kind of passage where mistakes were not forgiven. The trio moved swiftly as they prepared for the descent. Christine watched as Jack secured his harness and stepped over the edge, his rope sliding smoothly through the belay device as he disappeared into the blackness. Ben followed close behind. Alone at the top, Christine adjusted her gear, her movements steady and practiced. She clipped onto the rope and began her descent. The chimney walls pressed in close, rough and unyielding. The damp rock sapped warmth from her hands as she gripped the rope. Jack and Ben's voices echoed faintly from below, their words indistinct. Christine paused briefly to listen, then continued downward. The chimney grew narrower, forcing her to angle her body awkwardly. She moved carefully, calculating each step. Jack and Ben had already reached the bottom. They untied and moved deeper into the cave. "Let's check this lead," Jack muttered, his excitement building. Ben nodded in agreement. They didn't wait for Christine. She was experienced, and they assumed she'd catch up soon enough. Christine was halfway down the chimney when the trouble began. The walls constricted sharply, leaving barely enough room for her to move. She turned her body sideways to navigate the tight passage, her chest brushing against the rock. Then her foot slipped. Her body jolted violently. She came crashing down, trying to hold on to something. She kept on slipping deeper, slamming chest first into the narrowest part of the shaft. Pain exploded through her torso as a sickening crack rang out. Her ribs felt as if they'd been shattered, and a burning sensation spread across her chest. The pain was immediate, searing. Christine instinctively tried to move, but the rocks held her in place. Her ribs felt as if they had shattered. Every shallow breath sent sharp, electric shocks of pain coursing through her torso. She clawed at the walls, trying to push herself free, but her arms couldn't find any leverage. Her legs dangled uselessly below her, unable to touch anything solid. She kicked desperately, each movement sending more jolts of pain radiating through her body. Far below, Jack and Ben were oblivious. They crouched near a narrow opening, inspecting the next passage. Their voices were calm, excited, and completely unaware of Christine's distress. The thrill of discovery consumed them. Jack pointed his headlamp down the new lead, marveling at the sharp twists of the rock. "This looks promising," he said, motioning for Ben to follow. Neither man stopped to wonder why Christine hadn't arrived yet. Christine was trapped. Her body wedged against the unforgiving rock, her breathing shallow and labored. Panic clawed at her mind as she realized her calls for help had gone unanswered. She knew Jack and Ben were too far away to hear her. She tried to move, but the pain in her chest intensified. Her fractured ribs ground against one another with every attempt to free herself. Sweat poured down her face as her breaths became faster, more erratic. For a moment, she froze. She imagined the hours ticking by, her strength waning until she could no longer fight. The thought of dying here, alone in the suffocating darkness, ignited a wave of panic. "No," she thought, clenching her teeth against the pain. "Not like this." She forced herself to think clearly. Her pack was slung awkwardly over her shoulder, the strap dangling close to her hand. She grabbed it, her fingers trembling as she swung it toward a small rock projection just within reach. The strap missed. She tried again, gritting her teeth as her ribs screamed in protest. On the third attempt, the strap caught. With every ounce of strength she had left, Christine pulled herself upward. The movement was agonizing, each inch sending fresh waves of pain through her body. Finally, she freed herself from the choke point and then suddenly slipped through the narrow crevice, falling onto the cave floor. Exhausted and battered, she collapsed onto a narrow ledge. Jack and Ben were now deep in the cave, their focus fixed on the twisting passageways ahead. The excitement of discovery drowned out any thoughts of Christine's absence. Christine was moving again, but barely. She found Jack and Ben examining another lead. They turned to see her pale, sweat-drenched face. She didn't need to say anything. Her condition was obvious. Her breathing was shallow and labored, her movements sluggish. Jack and Ben exchanged a panicked glance, their earlier excitement evaporating. Jack moved quickly to support her, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. Ben fumbled to grab a water bottle from his pack, holding it out with shaky hands. "You need to drink," he said, his eyes scanning her pale, sweat-soaked face. Christine nodded weakly, but barely had the strength to lift the bottle. Jack helped her take a sip, watching as she struggled to catch her breath. "We can't stay here," Jack said, his tone urgent. "She's in bad shape. We need to get her out, now." Ben nodded, already securing the gear they'd need for the ascent. Christine's legs buckled slightly as Jack and Ben helped her to her feet, each of them taking an arm to steady her. Every movement sent a grimace of pain across her face, her shallow, labored breathing a constant reminder of her condition. The journey back to the surface was excruciating. Christine's body trembled as she climbed the 70-foot chimney, her strength fading with each pull on the rope. Jack climbed just ahead of her, his hands ready to catch her if she faltered. Ben stayed below, shouting encouragement as she fought to keep going. When they finally emerged into the open air, Christine collapsed onto the ground, her body convulsed with exhaustion, her breath shallow and uneven. Jack and Ben rushed to her side, their faces pale with fear. They drove her to the nearest hospital, where the full extent of her injuries became clear. Several ribs were fractured, and her lungs had been dangerously close to collapse. In the aftermath, Christine's ordeal haunted the group. They had broken the most basic rule of caving: never leave anyone behind. Their excitement had blinded them to the dangers, and it had nearly cost Christine her life. For Christine, the memory of being trapped, of the crushing rock and the suffocating darkness, stayed with her forever. Up and Down Cave was no longer a place of discovery. It was a place of survival, a grim reminder of how close she had come to the edge. The next story is as crueling as it can get. Imagine watching your friend desperately fighting for his life, and you, on the other hand, just watch helplessly. Ellison's Cave in Georgia is a vertical caver's dream, a maze of plunging drops and hidden passageways. Among its features is Incredible Pit, a 440-foot vertical drop that attracts skilled adventurers from around the country. But on 10th March 1999, 28-year-old Harold Allen Bufford, known to friends as Hal, the cave became a deadly trap. Hal entered the cave on Tuesday morning with two companions, Chris Andrews and Anthony Bates. The trio were experienced cavers and had planned their descent into Incredible Pit carefully, or so they thought. After navigating the cave's stair-step entrance and its two initial pits, 80 and 83 feet deep, they reached the lip of Incredible Pit, where the real challenge began. Incredible Pit is not just a vertical drop. A sizable stream flows into the pit, creating a waterfall that cascades relentlessly for its entire length. The roar of the water is deafening, the spray constant, and the chill inescapable. Two ropes dangled side by side into the void. One, a 1/2-inch rope, had been left by a previous group. The second was a 7/16-inch rope the trio had rigged themselves. Descending the pit was grueling, but uneventful. Each caver carefully worked their way down, braving the freezing water that battered them the entire way. At the bottom, they explored the cavern's passages, marveling at the otherworldly formations carved by centuries of water flow. Late that evening, it was time to ascend. Climbing out of a pit as massive as Incredible Pit is physically demanding and mentally taxing. Chris climbed first, followed by Anthony. Both men emerged at the top, soaked and exhausted, but relieved to be on solid ground again. Hal was last to climb. By the time he began his ascent, it was nearly 11:30 p.m. The noise from the waterfall made communication difficult, so Chris and Anthony could only watch as Hal's headlamp began its slow journey upward. The rhythm of his movements seemed steady, reassuring his companions that he was making good progress. But around midnight, something went wrong. From above, Chris and Anthony caught faint, muffled cries. It took them a moment to understand that the voice was Hal's. The sound barely pierced through the relentless roar of the waterfall. Chris leaned over the edge, straining his eyes to see through the mist swirling below. In the dim, erratic light, he spotted Hal dangling precariously on the rope, his body swaying and his movements frantic. Hal was gesturing wildly, clearly panicking, his mouth opening and closing as he shouted for help. Though the words were swallowed by the deafening cascade, the two knew descending Incredible Pit again wasn't an option. The rope, already under immense strain from Hal's weight, was dangerous to use. A secondary accident could turn an already dire situation into a catastrophe. As Hal continued to flail and shout, the realization of their helplessness settled heavily on them. Hal was approximately 150 feet up the 440-foot rope when he encountered this critical problem. His ropes had become tangled, an issue common when two ropes are rigged close together in a deep pit. To make matters worse, Hal was climbing the 1/2-inch rope using ascenders designed for smaller diameters. The friction slowed his progress and complicated his movements. Freezing and fatigued, Hal decided to switch from climbing to rappelling, a complex maneuver requiring precision. But something went horribly wrong. Both his ascenders were under tension, one on each rope. His rappel rack had been partially rigged, but wasn't functional. Hal was stuck, unable to ascend or descend. The waterfall pummeled him relentlessly, soaking his inadequate clothing. Unlike his companions who wore wetsuits, Hal was dressed in a plastic rain suit over denim overalls and a cotton thermal shirt. Cotton, infamous for its inability to insulate when wet, clung to his skin, rapidly leaching away his body heat. Time was running out. Hal Buffer dangled 150 feet above the cavern floor, trapped in a hellish limbo. The relentless cascade of the waterfall drenched him in frigid, bone-chilling water. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. His breathing was ragged, his movements jerky and desperate. Above him, Chris and Anthony strained to see through the mist. Hal's arms ached from gripping the ascenders, his muscles screaming in protest. He fumbled with his gear, trying to re-rig it for a descent. His hands were numb, the cold leaching all strength and precision from his fingers. His teeth chattered uncontrollably. From above, his friends watched in growing horror. Chris leaned dangerously close to the edge, gripping the rope as if he could somehow will Hal to climb higher. Anthony paced frantically, torn between the desire to descend and the grim reality that any attempt to do so might worsen the situation. Chris and Anthony could do nothing but watch, which haunted them. They finally made the decision. They exited the cave as quickly as possible, navigating the treacherous passages back to the surface. By 2:30 a.m., they reached Walker County 911, launching a full-scale rescue operation. The Georgia Department of Natural Resources, Walker County Cave Rescue, and other volunteer groups responded swiftly. Rescue teams, many of them experienced vertical cavers, began arriving at the scene in the early hours of Wednesday morning. The mission was clear: get Hal off the rope and out of the cave. Rescuers reached the lip of Incredible Pit by 9 a.m., nearly 9 hours after Hal's distress call. They rigged a hauling system with pulleys and ropes, preparing for the difficult task of lifting him out. One rescuer shouted into the pit, hoping back for a response from Hal. The only response was the unrelenting roar of the waterfall. Two rescuers descended cautiously. At the 150-foot mark, they found Hal. He was motionless, hanging limp in his harness. Hal's body was wedged in place by his equipment, his weight split between the tangled ropes. His head was slumped forward, his skin pale and cold. He had succumbed to hypothermia and positional asphyxia hours earlier, a victim of the relentless cold and the harness that had immobilized him. Carefully, the rescuers secured his body to the haul system. They worked methodically, knowing that any mistakes could jeopardize their own safety. Slowly, Hal's body was lifted out of the pit, emerging into the daylight late Wednesday evening. Hal's death marked the first fatality in Ellison's cave and left a lasting impact on the caving community. More than 60 people participated in the rescue and recovery effort, with 35 entering the cave and others providing support on the surface. Despite their best efforts, Hal's life could not be saved. This last story is even more terrifying, and the consequences are worse. It was a crisp morning on February 23, 1984. The sun had barely risen over Maui, Hawaii, when a group of divers boarded Ed Robinson's dive boat. These tourists, brimming with excitement, were about to embark on a diving expedition that none of them realized would end in disaster. John Baird, Tom Colin, Masao Nakan, and Preston Penny, all certified open water divers, trusted their guides, Robinson and his assistant Sue, to navigate the treacherous underwater world awaiting them. Yet, beneath the calm waters near Cape Kinau lay a cave system, alluring but fraught with dangers they were woefully unprepared for. Their destination was a cavernous maze carved into the seabed, known for its stunning underwater chambers. But it was also notorious for its silty floors and narrow passages, hazards that would soon turn their dive into a frantic struggle for survival. The divers reviewed the plan aboard the boat. It was straightforward enough, or so it seemed. Robinson would lead the group, armed with a video camera to capture their adventure. Sue would act as the safety diver, staying at the rear. Each diver was issued a single flashlight, and a critical rule was laid out. An air check would occur at the midpoint. If anyone's air supply dropped below 1,500 psi, they would return immediately. With this briefing, the group plunged into the crystal-clear waters and descended toward the Cape Kinau cave. The cave's main passage was vast at its entrance, wide enough for 6 divers to swim side by side. But as they ventured further, the space constricted. Sunlight faded, leaving only the beams of their flashlights to pierce the darkness. Things went smoothly, which is why they never laid out the guideline as they moved deeper. Perhaps subconsciously they had forgotten that what seems apparently fine in the underworld is only a ploy to a disaster that could strike any time. The cave's layout, while seemingly simple, was deceptive. A narrow restriction led from the main trunk to the deep chamber. It was in this chamber, at a depth of nearly 100 feet, that the serenity of their dive began to unravel. Tom Colin glanced at his pressure gauge and felt a jolt of anxiety. His air supply had plummeted to 600 psi, dangerously low for a cave dive. He signaled to Robinson, who began to guide him toward an exit. But Colin wasn't alone in his predicament. John Baird checked his own gauge and realized he too was on borrowed time. Visibility, already poor, was rapidly deteriorating as silt from the cave floor clouded the water. Robinson led both men out through a third entrance, but the exit was anything but smooth. As Colin's air supply dwindled to nothing, his sonic alarm shrieked in the eerie silence. Robinson shared his air, a life-saving gesture, but at the surface, the grim reality set in. Only Baird still had air left, a mere 100 psi. Meanwhile, chaos was brewing in the deep chamber. The visibility had degraded to near zero. The silt stirred by their movements created a suffocating cloud, and even the beams of their flashlights could barely cut through the darkness. Sue signaled to the remaining divers, Masao Nakan and Preston Penny, to exit the chamber immediately. Nakan fought his way through the tight restriction, emerging into the main trunk, but Preston struggled. The narrow passage seemed to close around him as he pushed forward, hindered by the swirling silt. Sue had to physically push him through, both of them finally making it out of the chamber. Nakan and Sue swam toward the middle exit. The relief of escaping the silty chaos was palpable. But then, as they surfaced, Sue scanned the group. Something was wrong. Preston was missing. A creeping dread settled over the group. Preston had been there just moments ago. His flashlight beam was just right there when they were getting out. Where was he now? They knew something down there went horribly wrong. Time was running out. Robinson acted swiftly. Grabbing an extra air cylinder, he re-entered the cave. The silence was deafening as he retraced their route through the passages. The silt had settled slightly, revealing fragments of the chaotic scene left behind. Then, in the dim glow of his flashlight, Robinson saw him. Preston lay motionless on the cavern floor, his camera in one hand, his flashlight in the other. His gear appeared intact, but his air cylinder was completely empty. The sight was chilling, not for its violence, but for its stillness. Preston had simply run out of air, his body succumbing in silence. Robinson brought him to the surface, but the outcome was inevitable. Efforts to revive him were futile. Preston was gone. The tragedy was complete. The aftermath was marked by somber reflection and harsh critique. Preston's death was preventable, a culmination of critical oversights and poor preparation. None of the divers had formal cave diving training. There was no guideline to navigate the passages. The group had failed to adhere to the 2/3 air rule, a standard that ensures enough air to exit a cave. At the midpoint air check, at least half the group had already reached unsafe limits. The dive had been reckless from the start, an accident waiting to happen, as experts would later describe it. For those who survived, the memories of that dive would never fade. The Cape Kinau cave, once a symbol of underwater wonder, became a grim reminder of nature's unforgiving power. As the diving community analyzed the tragedy, the warnings were clear. Caves demand respect and preparation. Dive with a plan, or risk never surfacing again.